Mastercard. Immersion sammandrag. På tennisveckan mår den riktigt bra. Att spruta ut champagne. Att inte ha någon skam. Bonusmiljoner shoppar loss i trans. Det började med 1, 2, 3. Du kanske borde hänga med du med.
Jag är övertygad om att jag gör mig till tolk för alla som är här idag när jag säger att vi ser fram emot dagens seminarium med oerhörd spänning, intresse, förväntan. Allt sedan jag fick den här boken i min hand så har jag känt en stor och större optimism att vi i vänstern ska lyckas mycket bättre med att nå ut med vår politik, få stöd för vår politik. Den här boken ger oss vänsterpolitiker, vänsteraktivister ett mycket starkt instrument i vårt politiska arbete. Vi kan nu äntligen visa att vetenskaplig forskning ger belägg för att den politik som vi arbetar för är den bästa politiken för alla. Jag tror många av oss har upplevt att när vi argumenterar för vänsterpolitik så möts vi ofta av att man säger ja visst, vänsterns politik kan vara bra för utsatta grupper, för de svagaste i samhället. De kanske vinner på vänsterns politik. Vi har hela tiden vetat att det inte är så. Alla vinner på vänsterns politik. Men med den här boken så har vi vetenskaplig forskning som visar att den här politiken är bättre för alla. Och det tycker jag ger oss otroligt hopp om framtiden. Jag är också väldigt glad över att det i boken också tas upp mycket om kampen mot klimatförändringar. Också ur ett jämlikhetsperspektiv. Hur olika grupper av befolkningar, hur olika länder sätter olika ekologiska avtryck. Och att vi med den här boken som underlag kan visa att ett både jämlikt samhälle, ett klimaträttvist samhälle är möjligt. Att det är politiska beslut som har lett fram till det samhälle vi lever i idag med ökade klyftor, försämringar, ett samhälle vi inte vill ha. Det är politiska beslut. Då känns det fantastiskt att vi nu kan visa att med andra politiska beslut så är det möjligt att bygga ett annat, jämlikt, bättre samhälle för alla dess medborgare. Därför är förväntningarna också väldigt stora idag på att få ytterligare kunskaper, diskussioner om de här förutsättningarna. Så återigen vill jag naturligtvis hälsa alla varmt välkomna. Och naturligtvis extra varmt välkommen till författaren, forskaren Wilkinson, som till vår stora glädje har tagit sig tid och tillfälle att delta på vårt seminarium idag. Vi ska nu i 1 timme få information från författaren och forskaren till den här boken. Jag vill också säga att Wilkinson är professor emeritus vid universitetet Nottingham Medical School. Återigen väldigt varmt välkommen till oss och vi ser fram emot både denna kommande timmens föreläsning och därefter att vi får tillfälle till diskussion. Välkommen och varsågod.
Our book is sometimes called A Theory of Everything because we deal with violence and health, both physical and mental health, and teenage birth rates and how many people there are in prison in different countries, and a whole range of these problems. It's not a theory of everything, it's a theory of problems that have social gradients, the kind of problems that are more common at the bottom of the social ladder, in the poorest areas of our society. I think people look at these social gradients in different problems and they think, well, you know, the vulnerable move down and the resilient move up, and that's why we have social gradients. But I'm going to show you that these problems are anything from twice as common to 10 times as common in societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor. And no amount of sorting the population with social mobility can explain why problems become more common in more unequal societies. So basically, I think the gist of our book is to show that these problems are responses to social status differentiation itself, particularly to low social status, but status competition, status insecurity, all sorts of things like that. But anyway, let me start with technology isn't going to work for me. Yeah. This is a graph of national income per person along the bottom against life expectancy. You can see that amongst the poorer countries there's a very rapid rise. There's a very rapid rise in life expectancy, and then it levels out. I'm going to be talking about the rich developed countries on the top right-hand part of that graph. What's interesting about that graph is if you look at happiness or at measures of well-being, you see a very similar shape. Rapid rises in the early stages of economic growth, and then it levels off. I think that is a curve of diminishing returns to economic growth. You know, in poorer countries where many people haven't got basic necessities, it's really important to have growth. But for us in the rich world, to have more and more of everything makes less and less difference. And that's basically what that graph is showing us. But it's a really important point. Now we're running into the environmental limits of economic growth. But it's also important to me, talking about inequality, because I want to make a sharp distinction between the absolute, the real material living standards and the relative differences in a society, the differences between us. I'm talking about the differences between us, not the absolute level. And for simplicity, I'm just talking about those rich developed societies on that flat part of the curve, the top right, where you see there is no effect of GNP per capita on life expectancy. So, you know, this is just blowing up those rich developed countries, the same graph, but with the poorer countries missing. So these are the countries I'm going to be talking about. You can see that countries on the right, like USA and Norway, are twice as rich as countries like Israel, Greece and Portugal on the left. And it makes no difference at all to their life expectancy. There's no suggestion of difference. And yet within each of our societies, there are extraordinary social gradients in health. This is small areas in England and Wales, but you know, in other countries, many other countries, it looks very much the same. Health is arranged by deprivation, so on the right are the most deprived areas with the shortest life expectancy, and on the left, the richest areas with the highest life expectancy. Those figures are a few years old, so they should, all those bars should be a little bit higher. But, you see, it's not a problem just of the poor in relation to the rest of society. These health inequalities go right across the society. So even the people just below the top are not as healthy as people at the top. And when you're thinking about health inequalities, you must not just think about poverty, absolute poverty. That doesn't explain most of it. Perhaps the foremost researcher in the world on these issues, Michael Marmot, he says you can take away the entire problem of poverty and ill health, and you've still got most of the problem of health inequalities left. We can talk about the tiny proportion of the population who are homeless or whatever. But this is about the majority of the population, the vast majority of the population. Most of them have cars, they have central heating, they have, you know, DVDs, they have, well, the American poor now, over a third of them have dishwashers. The people who come below the federal poverty line in the United States. So we need to think about explanations that fit the data. What is actually happening in these societies? When I talk about equality and inequality, I'm never talking about extremes, I'm never talking about perfect inequality, perfect equality that doesn't exist. I'm simply talking about the amount of inequality in each of the rich, developed market democracies on that flat part of the first curve I showed you. The measure we use, simply because you can get it from the UN website and the World Bank, is how much richer are the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%. And so you see in the more equal countries, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the top 20% are about 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. But in the more unequal societies, like the UK, Portugal, USA, the gap is twice as big. On this measure, they're twice as unequal. And really what I'm going to do is to show you what that means, what that does to a society. I said that our book is really a problem about, in a way it's a theory of problems with social gradients. And our media, you know, I don't actually read Time, I never see it actually, but you can see how the media are preoccupied with all these problems. Extraordinary social contrast, extraordinary contrast between the material success of our societies and their many social failings. You know, whether it's kids dropping out of high school, or antisocial behavior, or drug problems, or teenage birth rates. Or in the middle you've got 3 men in prison. This is a bunk for 3, presumably in a cell for 1. Prison overcrowding, you know. What we've done is simply collect internationally comparable data on these kinds of problems. So we collected internationally comparable data on life expectancy, on maths and literacy scores, on infant mortality rates, on homicide rates, imprisonment. That's simply the proportion of people in prison in each country. Teenage birth rates, trust, that's how much people feel they can trust others in society. Obesity rates, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. All these problems, you know, have social gradients, more common at the bottom of society, in nearly all countries in the developed world. What we've done is put them all together in one index, our index of health and social problems. It's like just a bag full of health and social problems. They're all weighted equally. So where a country is its sort of average position on violence and drugs and everything else. And there you see their score in relation to the measure of inequality I've just shown you. There's an extraordinarily clear tendency for the more unequal societies. The more unequal societies in these graphs is always on the right-hand side, to do worse on all those kinds of measures. Got the USA, Portugal, UK, down here, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan. It looks like something out of physics rather than social sciences, and it's really extraordinarily close. But if you look at exactly that same measure on the vertical axis in relation to national income per person along the bottom, there's no relationship. You might think that with Portugal up on the top right, that there's perhaps a downward drift like that, but forget Portugal, and remember the USA is up there, and you can see why the statistics say there's no relationship at all between those. We were a little worried that because inequality is a politically sensitive subject, that people would think we just selected problems to choose our argument. So we decided we would look at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. There's a UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing designed to measure child well-being in the rich countries. It contains 40 different components. So whether children can talk to their parents, what immunization rates are like, whether children have books at home, how they do in these maths and literacy tests, all that goes into the UNICEF Index. One of the components is the proportion of children in each country in relative poverty. That's very like a measure of inequality. So we took it out. We didn't want people to say this is a circular argument. Of course, relative poverty is related to inequality, so that went out. So here are the remaining 39 components of that UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing in relation to that same measure of inequality. And you see the more unequal countries have lower levels of child well-being. So this is not us selecting problems. I mean, you can see that we've got most of the problems you would expect to find internationally comparable data for with social gradients, so we haven't been selecting. But if you like, you can regard our index of health and social problems as an index of adult well-being, and this is children's well-being. They show the same pattern. And look at that index of child well-being, exactly the same index in relation to national income per person. Once more, no relationship at all. Not even a suggestion of relationship. I often get frustrated or annoyed with children's charities that can talk about child poverty all the time without distinguishing between relative poverty and absolute poverty. No, and it makes it uncontroversial politically because people can say what we need is more incentives to industry that will lift children out of poverty. That's not the issue. Some of those countries are twice as rich as others, and it doesn't help. What matters is where children are in relation to the rest of us, the kind of how unequal the society is that they're growing up in. That's what matters. I'm now going to show you some of the individual components of our index, so you can get an idea of the sort of how close or loose these relationships are. This is a measure of trust from the World Values Survey. It's simply the proportion of population who agree that most people can be trusted. I don't know whether you feel, it's a vague question. I don't know whether you'd agree that most people can be trusted or not, but what people say is quite closely related to inequality. All these relationships I'm showing you are highly significant statistically. You can't attribute them to chance. But amongst the more unequal countries, only about 15% of the population feel they can trust others. But at this end, the more equal countries, it rises to 60 or 65%. If I showed you measures of social capital, the sort of things that Putnam produced, both in his Italian study and in hhis Bowling Alone, his study of the American states, similarly close relationships. I think what I'm showing you actually is the truth of that intuition that people have had since the French Revolution or before, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. That's what the data shows, again and again. And I think actually measures of trust tell us a lot about the social fabric and what it's like, particularly for women, to walk home alone at night in any of our major cities. You know, you'd feel much safer in one of the more equal societies. But I think all sorts of other things about how the society works are easier where there are higher levels of trust. We've done all this work twice. We looked at all these relationships on the rich developed countries, and then we repeated it all, looking at the 50 American states, asking the same question: do the more equal American states do better on all these problems? The relationships are very similar, almost always. Where there is a statistically significant relationship with a problem and inequality internationally, You also find that the same in the American states. There are a few differences that we explain in our book, but we show the data on each problem for internationally and for the American states. So here is that same measure of trust. It comes from the General Social Survey, the federal government survey in the United States. So these are the American states. And very similar scatter. It doesn't go quite as low at the unequal end, but it goes very similar height on the more equal end. You can see that, you know, this is the same sort of picture. This is a measure of mental illness from WHO. This is not simply people coming in to their doctor asking for antidepressants or sleeping pills. This is work that WHO did to allow us to make really good comparisons of levels of mental illness in each country. What they did is use the same diagnostic interviews in relation to random samples of the population in each country. And on the vertical axis, it's simply the proportion of the population who had any mental illness in the preceding year. And you'll see at the bottom here, I suppose about 8% of the population had some kind of mental illness in the preceding year. Mainly depression, anxiety problems, things like that. But it rises to 4 times that level. Sorry, 3 times that level in the more unequal countries. Whole populations with 3 times as much mental illness as others, and substantially related to inequality. I'll leave that point. This is infant mortality rates. You might look at this and think that that line of best fit, that regression line, should be steeper. It's being affected by Singapore there. Bottom right, Singapore. Singapore claims to have the lowest infant mortality rates in the world. I never believed that figure, but it's the figure WHO gives for Singapore, so it goes into our data. Our critics from the political right have accused us of picking and choosing data. If I was picking and choosing data, I would certainly have left Singapore out. But we have an absolute rule. If our source gives data for one of the countries in our data set, it goes in, even if we think it's completely mistaken. In fact, I've recently been to Singapore, and I know one of the reasons why their infant mortality rate appears to be so low. It's because they have 25% of their workforce, the bottom 25%, are migrant workers. They're not allowed to have babies, and they're not allowed to get married. They have a health check each year, and if they get married or are pregnant, they get sent home. So you take the bottom 25% of the population where you expect infant mortality to be highest, out of the picture completely. So that regression line should really be steeper. I may say that I get very annoyed with this accusation that we pick and choose data. There are some graphs. I mean, the previous graph I showed you, yes, this one. You see, not all the countries are there, because WHO haven't produced the data for all the countries. They haven't done those random samples using the same diagnostic interviews. Incidentally, since we first published this graph in one of the academic journals, more countries have come in with data. And they come in very much where we'd expect them. We didn't originally have data for, I think, New Zealand and Australia, or one or two of those. But the levels of mental illness in those countries are very much what we'd expect, given their level of inequality. So this theory has some predictive value. That's true on a number of the bits of data I'll show you. This is drug abuse, from figures from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. It's survey data on use of opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, and amphetamines. We put them all into one index again, and you can see a clear tendency for more unequal countries to have more drug problems. We don't put figures up the side because the units are what statisticians call standard deviation units that don't mean very much to most of the population, and we were trying to write an accessible book. This one is teenage birth rates. It's births per 1,000 women in their teens. And you see at the bottom it goes to about 5 births per 1,000 women in their teens, or a bit less than that. And it goes up to, well, in Europe, UK is the highest in Europe, at 6 times that level, and the USA 10 times that level. I once worked in health promotion a very long time ago. We would have been absolutely delighted if we could have made just a 10% reduction in a problem. You know, a measurable effect, 10% reduction. But I'm showing you tenfold differences across whole populations, not just little differences between different risk groups, but vast differences. This is somebody else's work. This is homicide rates, violence. They've used the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality that economists like. It's harder to understand, so we don't use it, but inequality is still on the right-hand end. These dots are the American states, but because Daly and Wilson, who have specialized in work on violence for a long time, because they are Canadian, they include these little Canadian provinces on the bottom left. Canadian provinces are more equal and have lower homicide rates. But look again at the differences. We've got about 15 homicides per million there, and it goes up to 150. Again, a tenfold difference. Now, the graph in our book isn't as close as that. You know, on the countries we include, it's statistically significant relationship, but it's not so striking. What we do is, basically, we want to show these relationships on the same group of countries, the same measure of inequality. You know, whatever you're talking about, the more unequal countries do worse. Our critics come along and they look at our graph and they say, well, if you take this country off and that country off, it's not a significant relationship anymore. I say, doesn't matter at all. There are 50 papers in the academic journals showing this is a really robust relationship. A review as early as 1993 said that this was a robust relationship, and there have been many more studies since then confirming it in lots of different settings. The political critics who come from things like the Taxpayers Alliance and so on, they pretend that ours is the only evidence that inequality is harmful, and that we've somehow manufactured the evidence. They accuse us of picking and choosing. They don't realize that when a data point is missing, it's because it's not in the source of our data. The only academic disagreements, academics agree that these relationships exist. What they argue about is the interpretation of the relationship. Quite different. And on some of these things, I'm looking at health in relation to inequality. There are 200 papers in the academic journals looking at that. So it's completely ridiculous to look at our data and pick a few countries off, or say, if you add in another few countries, it disappears or something. You know, they accuse us of picking and choosing, which we never do, and they pick and choose to destroy the relationships we show. Anyway, enough of that. This one is prisoners per 100,000 population. Note that the vertical scale is what's called a log scale. It tends to compress the top of the picture. It means the difference from 1 to 10 is the same as from 10 to 100 or 100 to 1,000. And if we didn't do that, this curve would go zoom, it would curve right up there, and the USA would be on the ceiling. The important thing about this graph is not simply the scale of differences. It's a bit harder on a log scale to judge where the intermediate numbers are, but 40 would be higher than you might expect, somewhere there, and it goes up to around 400. So again, you've got tenfold differences in the proportion of the population locked up in each country. When we were writing the book, we found there were over 300 people with life imprisonment for shoplifting in California, because they have that 3 strikes and you're out principle. And really quite barbaric, I think. But this relationship is not primarily driven by more crime, it's driven by more punitive sentencing. We looked at the trends in the prison populations in Britain reached their maximum after our crime rates had been declining for some years. We found several research papers in the United States trying to explain the rise in their prison populations, and it said that those were driven, only about 25% of it was more crime. Most of it is harsher sentencing, longer sentencing, people sent to prison more often. And I think you need to think of that alongside the evidence that there are lower levels of trust, less involvement in community life, there's lower social capital in more unequal societies. I don't know whether sentencing is harsher because there's more fear up and down the social hierarchy, or whether there's less empathy, but it's another indication of something going wrong with the quality of social relations in different societies. This last one is social mobility. It's important because increasingly I think there are attempts to justify very big income differences in a society by saying it's perfectly fair if there is high social mobility, people can get to wherever their talents justify. You know, as if the accidents of birth and so on were fair in any sense. But the measure of social mobility used is income mobility. So they used the big cohort studies, random samples of the population of babies who've been followed through since birth in each country, and they look at the father's income when the baby was born. I'm sorry this is fathers and sons rather than mothers and daughters, but you can understand why. They look at the father's income when the son was born, and then what the son's income was 30 years later. So the son at age 30 and the father when the child was born, and they look at the correlation. So they're asking, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons? Or is there no relationship between them? And what this shows is that there is less relationship, father's income matters less in the more equal countries. There's more social mobility in those countries. My partner Kate likes to say that for the Americans who want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark or Finland. It's interesting actually, there was a recent bit of survey, some survey data, I think 50,000 people in the United States, and they were shown little pie charts of the distribution of wealth. They were shown 3, one where each fifth of the population got the same proportion of the wealth. One was the Swedish distribution, which it didn't say it was Swedish, it just showed that this is another society, and another was the American distribution. They were asked, what society would you like to live in? 92% of them chose the Swedish distribution. That's Americans choosing the Swedish distribution. It made very little difference, only 1 or 2 percentage points, whether people were Democrat or Republican, whether they were rich or poor. Nearly everyone preferred, just looking at these pie charts, the Swedish distribution to the American one. Really quite extraordinary. And the important thing about this graph is that the sort of utopian idea of equal opportunity, that children's chances should be equal in a society, is even more unobtainable in societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor. You know, I don't know whether you think of it as the social ladder being steeper and harder to get up, or the rungs on the ladder further apart. Joe Blandon, whose data we're using here, is produced other data showing this pattern in his report for the National Equality Panel commissioned by the last government in Britain. Professor John Hills comes to exactly the same conclusion, that equal opportunity is more unobtainable in more unequal societies. So, I want now to move on to, we give lots more of these graphs. I've just shown you a few of them. We give you lots more in the book showing different problems and so on, worse in more unequal societies. You know, this is really an attempt to explain problems with social gradients. And you know there are just so many of those problems with social gradients. But I think if I just said, look, problems that are more common at the bottom of the social ladder are worse in more unequal societies, you'd say, okay, that's probably because there are more poor people in more unequal societies. You'd slip back into thinking about absolute material standards. In fact, you know, the reason why inequality is increased is not because we have more poor, it's mainly because we have more rich. It's the people at the top who run away from the rest of us. That's the main reason why inequality has widened. But I've been pointing out the scale of the differences between between more and less equal societies. You know, anything from twofold differences to tenfold differences. Because those differences, you can see immediately, they're too big to be driven by the bottom 10%. You know, if that was your hypothesis and you put some figures in, you can do it on the back of an envelope, you cannot make any reasonable assumption to explain huge differences in the population average driven just by the bottom, what's happening to the poorest. But we don't simply infer that the majority of the population affected by inequality from that kind of consideration. We also are able to look at people at different positions in the social hierarchy, comparing more and less equal societies. This is very old data, comparing infant mortality in England with Sweden, with England and Wales compared to Sweden. When people first got interested in comparing infant mortality or health inequalities between countries. And some Swedish researchers kindly classified a lot of Swedish infant mortality by the British occupational class classification. So we could compare each social class really accurately between the two countries. And social class 1 is at the top. It's doctors and lawyers and directors of larger companies at the top. And it goes down through the non-manual occupations and then skilled manual, semi-skilled and unskilled manual. And again, anachronistically, because it's a classification by father's occupation, single parents go in their own bit and they unclassify. But you can see that Sweden does better than England and Wales all the way across the society, even at the top social class. Their infant mortality rates are a bit lower. Another research paper showed the same thing for adult mortality, arranged just the same way. We, in our book, have 5 or 6 graphs of this kind from different research papers, where you can compare how people in the each position in the social hierarchy do, and there's the same pattern, that the effects are biggest at the bottom of society, but even at the top there seem to be small benefits. I'm going to show you one other graph. This isn't in our book, but it shows the basic pattern. These are children's literacy scores. Well, they're young people, 16 to 25-year-olds' literacy scores in these international tests. And they're classified along the bottom, not by parent social class, but by parents' years of education. So on the right, you've got the children of well-educated parents, nearer the top of society. And you see, even there, it's a little bit better to be in Sweden than Canada or the USA, but it's really at the bottom of society that you get enormous differences. These graphs are not showing you whether Sweden has more or fewer people at the bottom than England and Wales does, or than the USA. They're saying wherever you are, you do better in a more equal society. Right across the board. And as I say, we have about 5 or 6 graphs illustrating that point. I may say, because our book attempts to make all this as accessible and easy to understand as possible, we leave out all the technicalities. And people who've never come across any of this before think that nobody's ever looked at any of the technical issues. But, you know, there are extremely sophisticated statistical methods, multi-level models, controlling for different education or absolute levels of income, individual income and education throughout the population, and they still find contextual effects that at any level of income or education, you do worse if you are in a more unequal society. Let's come back just briefly to this graph where we put it all together in one index. The main point I want to make is just that it's always the same countries that do badly. Giving this lecture in the United States is a little bit difficult, because they think maybe this is just some anti-American thing. So it's actually, for me, a relief to show them the graph of child well-being, where Britain does even worse than the United States. But you see, it's always the same countries at the top with the worst performance: USA, Portugal, UK, and it's always the same countries at the good end. The Nordic countries and Japan. Extraordinarily different cultures in those countries. I mean, to compare Sweden and Japan, for instance. So what we're looking at is a kind of general social dysfunction related to inequality. It's not just one or two things that go wrong, it's most things that go wrong. And if you're going to try and come up with another explanation, it must be an explanation which will explain why there's more drug abuse, and why there's more homicide, why there's more mental illness, why there are more people in prison, why there are more teenage births, why there's more obesity. You have to think of another explanation which will explain all this, plus the inequality. It can't be reverse causality, it can't be the problems causing these things, because for that you'd have to have another driver for all those different problems. And actually quite a few of them. I mean, there's no reason why juvenile obesity or juvenile violence, which are related to inequality, should affect income distribution. Having fat kids doesn't mean that your income suffers. And actually having bigger prison populations will, in the statistics, make the society appear more equal, because income distribution is a measure of non-institutional populations. It's looking at household income. So there are lots of reasons why reverse causality isn't an explanation. However, we know that our income difference is widened from countries started widening in about 1980. The sort of Thatcher and Reagan neoliberal economics, the monetarism, the rest of it, they weakened trade unions and they reduced top tax rates. They thought it didn't matter if inequality rose. But they never intended to have rises in all these other problems. Those were unintended consequences of what they did. So you can have an ideological change, a political change, or change in thinking which allows this to happen. But that teenage birth rates and obesity and violence and drugs all increase is an unintended consequence of the of politicians allowing income differences to rise. I think that's a really important point. But people sometimes say this isn't inequality, it's differences in national culture. You shouldn't get caught up in that, actually, for several reasons. One is, if you think it's the English-speaking countries, you can take them off this graph, and you've still got a significant relationship left. But remember, we've also done this work for the American states. But also remember that there are papers in the academic journals that show this is true of the Chinese provinces, or the countries of South America, or rich and poor countries together, or Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union after during the transition. You know, picking on something that might be an explanation of one factor on one set of data isn't good enough. This is something more fundamental. And it's something more fundamental that people have known about for a very long time, in that intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. It's also not a big jump in causality. All we're saying is that the problems which we know in our societies are related to social status become worse if you allow the status differences to increase. It's what you'd expect. I should say a little bit about why we're so sensitive to inequality. I'm an epidemiologist. Most epidemiologists are trained medically. I was one of the first people into epidemiology in Britain who came from a social science background. I started off doing economic history. But, you know, working on health inequalities, trying to discover what it was that created these huge differences in life expectancy between different social classes, and then moving on to social determinants of health more widely. The big change in our understanding that's come out of research over the last 20 years or so is how important the psychosocial processes are. That it's not simply your material circumstances that affect you directly, the kind of house and car you have. It's what you feel about living in those conditions, the anxiety, the depression, the feeling of hopelessness, of being trapped, of failure, of being looked down on. All those drivers of chronic stress. And increasingly, the biological effects of chronic stress are well understood on the immune system and the cardiovascular system and so on. I could go into that briefly if you want. But the main groups of psychosocial risk factor are low social status. And that, I don't mean just having a smaller house. I'm not talking about absolute standards. I'm talking about how big your house is in relation to other people, or how old your car is in relation to other people, your income in relation to others. Weak social affiliations, almost any measure of friendship or the quality of social relations is protective of health. This isn't just a sort of weak, wishy-washy factor, a vague factor. Recently there was a review of 150 papers looking at measures of friendship, social involvement and health, controlling for the level of health at the beginning of the study when you pick people up. And they find that friendship is more important than whether or not you smoke when you're looking at survival over a follow-up period. Friendship has a marginally bigger effect than smoking on survival in a follow-up period. And the third group of these psychosocial risk factors is stress in early life. Both maternal stress in pregnancy, which affects fetal development through a number of pathways. I mean, stress hormones like cortisol cross the placental barrier and affect fetal development, but also things like domestic conflict, poor attachment, things like that in early childhood, which cast a long shadow forwards. So health of people in my age and older is affected by those very early life things. It seems to me that what those three groups of psychosocial risk factors are telling us is perhaps about one underlying or common risk factor, which I call a sort of social evaluative threat. So if you think of the feelings of low social status, of not being valued, being looked down on, the anxieties, the stresses and so on, they're perhaps a little bit like the insecurities, stresses, feelings of not being valued that can come from early childhood. And friendship fits into that, because if you have friends, they're people who value you, appreciate you. If you feel people avoid you, you're excluded, they don't sit next to you, we all have those insecurities about maybe I'm unattractive, boring, socially gauche, they think I'm stupid, whatever it is. And I think those are perhaps close to the bottom of this picture. There are psychologists who've talked about our sensitivity to shame and embarrassment as the social emotion, the most important social emotion, because they say this is what conditions conformity. Why I behave in acceptable ways is because I experience myself through your eyes. We're very sensitive to, we don't want to look stupid in front of other people. And you see, for a species like ourselves, human beings, who depend not on instinctively programmed behavior, but on learned cultural behavior, other people are the bearers of that culture. And how I learn to behave in an acceptable way in my culture is by being worried about your judgments of me. Now, this kind of worry about appearances, what other people think of us and so on, was less serious, I think, in societies with stable communities, which we lost not so long ago. You know, I remember in my childhood meeting people who'd never been out of their home city, people in England who'd never been to London. I remember on the electoral register in some villages there were 40 people with the same surname. You know, this breakup of settled communities is pretty recent. And I think it makes us much more worried about social contact and appearances and our need for privacy and so on. You know, I think now a lot of people find it an ordeal. That, you know, if you're invited out to dinner, you say, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can face it tonight. That sense of social contact being something that you have to prepare yourself for and so on. That's, I think, a reflection of our kind of society, and we don't really feel we can relax until we're at home alone. But think about all this other social evaluative situations, you know, of young people coming onto the labour market, interviews, any kind of public performance where you can be judged. After I'd put forward this kind of explanation of those psychosocial risk factors, I found a meta-analysis of studies in which usually students had been invited into a psychological laboratory and given stressful things to do while having their cortisol responses measured. You can measure cortisol in blood or in saliva. And so they were given little mathematical problems to do, or they were asked to write about an unpleasant experience, or they were videoed while they did something. Lots of different stressors were used. And in the meta-analysis, what they wanted to see was what kind of stressors most reliably push up our levels of stress hormone, cortisol. And this is what they found. It was tasks that included social evaluative threat. The paper says threats to self-esteem or social status in which others can judge you negatively. That's what they say, really, what we're really sensitive to. Very much the picture I'd given you before. And of course that is why violence is more common in more unequal societies. Violence is triggered by people feeling loss of face, humiliation, disrespected, looked down I quote often an American prison psychiatrist who says he's never seen an act of violence that was not triggered by that sense of loss of face and humiliation. And of course, in a more unequal society, we judge each other more by status. There's more status competition, more status insecurity, and so we worry more about how we're seen. These social evaluative judgments become more important. You know, are you somebody I need to take notice of you? Or are you someone who doesn't matter at all and I can ignore? We judge each other increasingly in those terms. One other way I think this works, there are a whole range of experiments which are called stereotype threat experiments. This is one that comes from people at the World Bank. They got children from high and low castes in India to do mazes. They gave them bits of paper with a maze on, and they had to find their way into the middle. And the question was, how many of these can they solve in a given time? They did them under two conditions. One where they didn't know each other's caste, and the results were very similar. And then they did it again where they did know who were the high caste children and who were the low caste children. And suddenly a big gap opens up. And these experiments have been done in different settings with men and women, when you prime some idea that women are less good at this kind of thing or that kind of thing, you know, or you don't do that first. And whether you do it or not affects performance. It's been done with black and white students in the United States. Our performance is very affected by these sort of background social status prejudices and so on. Some of you may know the blue eyes experiments in an American high school, where the teacher said, you know, there's good research that shows that children with blue eyes do better than other ones. And sure enough, the blue-eyed children start doing better than the others. And then she says, after a week or two, she says, oh, I made a mistake, it's the brown-eyed children who do better. You could never get ethical permission to do this now, but its effects were dramatic. So these kinds of social stereotypes are powerful, and when we think about the poorer performance of kids from poorer families in our schools, we need to think about that kind of thing too. I've probably just about finished, but I do just want to emphasize this one element. Again and again in this area I've been talking about, social status and friendship come up as sort of opposite pairs. You know, if I knew how many friends each of you have, and if I also knew your social status, your job, your education and so on, your income, I could make some rough kind of prediction as to how long you'd live. It wouldn't be very good, but if we had 10 times as many people, we'd start getting quite strikingly good results. And so they come together as predictors of our individual health, social status and friendship. They come together, again, as an opposed pair when we look at you know, more unequal societies, bigger social status differences, all the issues to do with trust and friendship and social cohesion, all those measures weaken. They also come together because, you know, we tend to choose our friends from amongst our equals or near equals. We feel more at ease with people on the same level as us. And the reason why they come together repeatedly in those different contexts is that they're the two sides of the same coin. They're the opposite ways in which people can relate to each other. In any species, almost any species, there is a terrible potential for conflict because members of the same species have the same needs. They want the same foodstuffs. They want the same places to build nests or live or whatever. They compete for sexual partners. Monkeys, you can see, they compete for a nice place in the shade under the tree. And the dominants will make the subordinates go so they can have those things. But human, and of course that was why Hobbes, the political philosopher in the 17th century, talked about the competition of each against all as making life nasty, brutish and short if you didn't have a government to keep the peace. That was the basis of his political philosophy. But what he left out of the picture is not simply that we all have the potential of being each other's rivals, but we can also be the best source of security, of cooperation, of friendship, of love, of learning, all the positive things. And so, you know, human well-being has always been fundamentally influenced by the quality of social relationships. Whether you are the best or the worst for me depends on my relationships. And of course this gets into early childhood because that early sensitivity, which exists in endless different species, the early developmental processes which you know, pattern our development, our personality throughout our lives, that early sensitivity is about adapting to the kind of world we've got to deal with. And in human beings, it's about adapting to the kind of social relationships. So am I growing up in a society where I must watch my back, remember that you're all my rivals, and I must fight for what I can get? Or am I growing up in a society where I depend on maintaining good relationships with you, where my security depends on cooperation, empathy, trust, gaining your trust? Those two need quite different cognitive and emotional development. And we now know that there are epigenetic processes, i.e. early environment, changing gene expression, so we develop on a more social or less social trajectory from early childhood, because these things are so important. And why friendship and social status comes up in the epidemiology as such powerful risk factors working through stress is because we have this evolved sensitivity to stress, to the quality of social relations, sorry. So I think that's what we're talking about at the bottom. And of course, the gift is the symbol of friendship. Anthropologists have a nice phrase. They say gifts make friends and friends make gifts. Because the gift is the most concrete symbol that you and I don't compete for access. I'm not going to fight for you for the access to necessities. I give you this. I recognize your need. And that sense of reciprocity that some people suggest is universal, that indebtedness that makes you reciprocate the gift, is a basic sort of human social compact. Because there is always that awful thing. Are we going to fight over the basic access to basic necessities, or are we going to share and cooperate? That's what's behind it all. That's why we're so sensitive to the amount of inequality in society and shift the kind of social strategies we use to more competitive ones or more cooperative ones. We use both all the time, but the balance between them shifts. So I'll stop there. If anyone wants to use these slides, you can find them on the website, the Equality Trust website. We were encouraged to set up this website with help from the Rowntree Foundation, no, the Rowntree Charitable Trust in Britain to make this data better known. But the book has the data for, you know, the American states, and there's a chapter on each health and social problem, and as well as showing the data, it talks about the most likely causal pathways in each case. We also show the links between greater equality and sustainability, which I haven't had time to talk about, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Första klass Saint-Tropez. Sen kommer verkligheten fatta med.